Study? Okay, how many? Okay. Om Parthaya Pradibodhidam Bhagavata Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Gradidam Purana Munina Madhye Mahabharatam Advaidam Radavashinim Bhagavadim Ashtadashadhyayinim Ambatva Manusandadhami Bhagavad Gite Bhavadveshinim Yam Brahma Varunendra Rudramarudastunyam Didivaistavaihi Vedai Sangapadakramopanisadai Gayantiyam Samagaha Dhyanavasthita Tadgatena Manasa Pasyantiyam Yogino Yasyandam Navidusura Suragana Devaya Tasmai Namaha. We are discussing the 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, all these verses. And one important theme in these verses is, and that's very significant from a practical standpoint of spiritual life, technically it is called the doctrine of metempsychosis. So metempsychosis implies an area of study into the concept of reincarnation, this logical continuity of our life and existence and tendencies and impressions. It's a very important subject. So the subject opens with a question from Arjuna. It's a very logical question. The question, the verse is, Ayati Suddhayo Pedo Yoga Salida Manasaha Aprapya Yoga Samsiddhim Kam Gatim Krishna Gechati. This is, I think, yes, this is the 37th verse. The question is this: what happens to those who spend a lot of the time, energy and efforts to do spiritual disciplines, to practice spiritual disciplines like prayer, meditation, reading holy books, thinking about higher values in life? And if they do not fully succeed, or the seeker doesn't feel that he has fully progressed in his or her spiritual life, what happens to such a person? This is how it opens the whole subject, the 37th verse. So the answer that Lord Krishna gives is very simple. The answer is Parthanaiveha vinasastasya vidyade nahi kalyanakrit kaschit durgadim tada gacchati. The answer comes in the 39th verse. The answer is very simple. I already discussed this in my last session. So those who are attending this for the first time can just play the previous class video. The answer is, even if you do a little spiritual practice, it will have a permanent effect. It will deposit a huge wealth of good samskaras, impressions and vasanas in your mental system. And then in the coming verses you find this subject being more elaborately discussed. And Arjuna actually, he doesn't stop with a single question. In the 38th verse, he further elaborates his inquiry. And how does he expand his inquiry, his question? Kachinno bhayavibhrashtaha chinnabhramiva nasyati apradishto mahabaho vimudho brahmanapati. So he actually puts before us a very pertinent, very profound question, which is also a problem. Now, many of us, many people, many spiritual seekers may feel this. Suppose I don't fully succeed, I don't succeed enough, or if I fail, suppose you do a lot of spiritual discipline, spiritual practices, but then at one stage in your life before passing away, before our death, we suddenly drop our guard, so to speak. In modern times, these computer games, internet, TVs, and there are many sources of distraction which can take us away from our spiritual track, spiritual path. People sometimes will have problems of mind, going insane, frustration, bankruptcy, and so on. Then we lose faith in all these spiritual ideas and we think it's all absolutely bogus. We may think we may even become atheist, confirmed non-believers. It could happen. A kind of cynical attitude. So this could happen. In that case, what happens? Arjuna is actually putting before us this probability. I already discussed this again, and just repeating. That is, all the time, energy, money, everything that you spend for cultivating higher values and spiritual disciplines, all gone. At the same time, you did not gain much in this life in terms of material success. You could have as well spent a lot of time and energy for getting a better job, for acquiring wealth, money and status, instead of spending time and energy on spiritual things. This feeling could come. That's what Arjuna is actually asking about. Karchino Yoga-bhrashta means losing both the worlds, losing both the secular and also the spiritual. So it's just like a patch of clouds in the sky which can get scattered by a strong wind. Like that, everything can go astray. In answer to this, as I mentioned, Lord Krishna says, Parthanai Vehanamutra Vinasastasya Vidyade Nahi Kalyanakrit Kasti Durgadim Tadagachati. Do a little spiritual practice. You are not going to lose it. And this, why we are not going to lose it? Why we are never the losers in spiritual life? There can be losers in business. You may have to sue for bankruptcy. Stock markets can collapse. People whom you believe, who put faith in, can betray. And there could be a lot of problem, breach of promise, and many things happen in secular life. But that principle doesn't apply to spiritual life. So that simple idea is put forward. Nahi kalyanakrit kaschit. Kalyanakrit means somebody who does something good, something positive. That positive action can be something for your own spiritual progress. You meditated for some years, you read holy books for some years, or it could be the other way around. You may have served an institution, you may have helped a charitable society, you may have run a charitable organization, you may have founded a trust for helping people suffering from pandemic, many things like that. That is also one way of kalyana kasti, means doing something good. Because any noble action, even at the subjective level, like reading, prayer, meditation, or objective level, starting a trust, maybe sending some money to help people suffering from poverty and starvation, natural calamities in far off countries. All these constitutes some kind of noble activity. And that noble activity produces a result which is not seen or felt right now. But that will be put in your account even if you don't want it. You have to derive the beneficial result out of it. Lord Krishna says that Purvabhyasena tenaiva hrideki avashopi saha jijnasurapi yogasya sabda brahma adivartade. Maybe I think it is 44th verse. I am putting all these verses together, but we will take every single verse. So what Lord Krishna says is Purvabhyasa means you have done a lot of good things in the past. So you have put a lot of money in your spiritual bank. The bank sheet, the balance sheet shows so much of wealth in your name. You are born again. And even if you want to be a bad person, you cannot be. Because avashya means you are helpless. You are part of a momentum. And Shankaracharya, the original commentator who made this Gita a world spiritual classic by writing a commentary on this in the 8th century AD, he has got something very wonderful to say about this that we will discuss later. So, you will be helpless, you will be bound, will be carried on forward by the power, by the force of your own good actions, your own accumulated spiritual qualities, which will move you forward. No, suppose you say, no, I want to be a bad person. You cannot be if you have done a lot of good things in the past. Suppose you want to be a strong desire to be a bad person, you cannot be. Because the choice is not ours. That's why frequently we are the product of our samskaras, our impressions. It is true that we are products of circumstances, but circumstances become samskaras and impressions. That's how circumstances in this life or previous life eventually determine our destiny. Now, Lord Krishna is answering this, and not only that, Arjuna presses forward, Etan me samsayam Krishna chetum arkasi asheshataha todanya samsayasya asya cheta nahi upapadyate. That is 39th verse. This verse doesn't have anything much more to speak about. The simple meaning is this. This is my doubt. What is a doubt? Suppose a person with a lot of good intentions, good samskaras, good impressions, did a lot of spiritual practice, but had a deviation, had a fall, and he passes away. Do you think his life is gone, wasted? All the good deeds, all gone and wasted. Is it true? Arjuna is asking. Then he, in the 38th verse, he further expands his question with the help of a metaphor, an analogy. Just like a patch of clouds will be scattered all over the sky by a strong wind. So all the good actions completely wasted because you had a deviation just before you passed away. And then Arjuna in the 39th verse he further states that Edan me samsayam Krishna. This is my doubt. Actually, it's the doubt of every single spiritual seeker. This frequently happens. At one moment, at one stage in our spiritual life, suddenly you feel you are at a dead end. You are in the midst of conflicts and dilemmas and questions for which you don't find an answer. In the Christian mystical literature, the most telling example of this phenomenon is found in the autobiographical writings of Saint Teresa of Avila. And also you find there are many other books, but this unique work of the great woman saint of Spain is a classic example because she takes you through every step, every question, every moment of depression when she had to face problems. She had to face challenges. She was some kind of a reformer of her church, her denomination. So she had to face a lot of problems, but then suddenly challenges from outside and her own doubts and skepticism, and sometimes the feeling of frustration. You are at the end there is no light to be seen at the end of the tunnel. If that kind of feeling came to her frequently, that happens to spiritual seekers. That's precisely what Arjuna is talking about here. I remember Mahabharata dates to around 3 millennium BC, 3rd millennium BC. Shankaracharya wrote the commentary in the 8th century AD. So now from 41st verse onwards, the real discussion begins, the answer. I mean, the intricate mystery of this question, subject. What shall we do? How can we be sure that what we do is the right thing to do? Though this possibility, fear of tragedies and frustrations, the feeling that does it make any sense what I'm doing? Sometimes you may spend long years in meditation, prayer, and you may feel, oh, is it really of any value? Does it make any sense? That kind of feeling comes. So, in the 41st verse, which is very significant, Prapyak punyakrutam lokan ushitva shashwati samaha suchinam srimatam gekhe yoga-bhrashta abhijayati. So the subject of discussion here is yoga-bhrashta. Means somebody who has a deviation, some kind of a setback in spiritual life. What happens to such a person? So Lord Krishna answers this question from two different perspectives. One view is, there are those who have done a lot of spiritual practices, but they reached a point where they did not fully succeed in restraining their senses. So you find, having attained the worlds of the righteous, what happens? They live in these higher regions after death, and then they reincarnate in the home of a pure person who is not only pure but also prosperous. This is the simple literal meaning. What it means is, those who have done a lot of spiritual practices but have not fully succeeded in practicing shama. Shama is an important spiritual discipline, mean steadfastness. Its the definition according to Shankaracharya is virajya vishayavrada dosha-drishti muhurmuhu sulakshe niyatavastha manasas shama uchyate. Shama is this. So virajya vishayavrada dosha-drishti muhurmuhu. When we come in contact with tempting challenges, sensual, in the sensual world, at the sensory level, when we come in contact with things that can take us away from our spiritual life. It could be audio, it could be visual, it could be anything. When we are facing the possibility of a challenge, a threat to our spiritual life, by encountering some sensory objects, then what happens, what we should do is, we should constantly try to withdraw our senses away from the sense objects. Suppose a visual object, then you should try to turn your mind away from it. How? Dosha-drishti means you should think of the dangers, the problems of succumbing to those temptations. So, how dosha-drishti means seeing the dangers, the negative side of a temptation, of a tempting object, of a sense object. which could be a threat to our spiritual life, muhurmuhu, again and again. So again and again, we should try to remind ourselves of the dangers of being tempted by external sensory objects. Once we remind ourselves, then we won't be affected by this. The ability to detect the problem going on in our own mind and the ability to withdraw, the ability to show a red signal to our own mind, that is a spiritual faculty that grows automatically in our mind. When we read holy books, when we make it a habit to listen to higher ideas, when we make it a habit to associate with spiritually advanced people, when we discuss spiritual subjects, or when we practice any of the spiritual disciplines like prayer or meditation or anything, or doing good for others without any selfish motive. When we do any of these spiritual disciplines, what happens, we develop an inner mechanism, a self-correcting mechanism, which will dictate the problem going on in our own mind. So you'll be showing the red flag to yourself. This is something which I should be careful about. Now, there are certain spiritual seekers who have made a lot of efforts to develop this faculty, but not fully succeeded. That's one category. Remember, the Yoga-bhrashtas, those who are deviated from the spiritual path, are of two categories. The first category of Yoga-bhrashtas, those who are facing deviation, those who are distracted, that is being discussed in the 41st verse. What happens? They are born in a family which is prosperous. At the same time, which has an atmosphere and environment, the parents, relatives, at least some of the family members may be spiritually oriented. They will create a situation, a set of circumstances in the family which is conducive for spiritual life. So, they will be able to continue the spiritual journey from where they have left off in the previous life. So you can find this logical continuity from the previous existence. That's why two words are used. Suchinam, Srimada. Sri means either it could mean wealthy, it could mean prosperous, so that you will be able to fulfill some of your unfulfilled desires from previous life. You did not fully succeed in your previous efforts in the previous life because there was a problem. You could not fully practice total renunciation, total application, dedication to spiritual ideal. So what happens? There was a setback. You did not fully succeed. So you have to begin from where you left in your previous life. So you need prosperity, you need wealth, you need money, you need all these things, because after enjoying, after fulfilling your unfulfilled desires, you will be able to continue a spiritual journey. Remember, they have done a lot of spiritual practices in the past, in the previous life, so you accumulated a lot of spiritual wealth. That is a momentum, that force that moves you forward. But you did not fully succeed. So, in the evolutionary journey, momentum, you reach a point where you can begin your journey from next step onwards. Of course, there are one or two different interpretations in the Taittiriya Brahmana, in the ancient Vedic text. There is a mantra, Rajasama Nirjumshi Sahi Sir Murda Sadam. I mean, according to this Taittiriya Brahmana mantra, what it means is they are born in a family where there is wealth, where the circumstances are conducive to continuing a spiritual life from where you left off in previous life, and also you will have an opportunity to study the Vedas because your parents, your family background will be such. That's why according to Hindu astrology, I'm not talking about computer astrology, please remember that. I'm talking about the ancient Vedic astrology, which actually just science, it's pure science. There is nothing occult about it. You don't bring a bird and make it take a card in front of, nothing of the kind. It's an ancient science. Every sincere astrologer will tell you, it is science. It's pure mathematics. This is what it shows, and they won't claim omniscience. They won't say they are omniscient, not at all. So it's confused. So it also needs a lot of introspection, meditation, prayer. All these spiritual practices are part of the traditional Vedic astrology. They will tell you, and this is what they believe in. I neither believe nor disbelieve. So it's a pure science. So they would tell you, well, suppose a person is dead, he was a spiritual seeker, simultaneously there will be a parentage waiting for him, looking for an ideal son to be born in their family, because those parents also will be doing a lot of prayer and meditation, lot of spiritual practices, so that they want a good person to be born in the family, they want a good child to be born as their son or daughter, whatever maybe. So there is a kind of concordance, So souls, jivas travel across cultures, across boundaries of cultures, nationalities, races, continents. It is a cosmic transmigration. Anyway, the point is the samskaras, vasanas and vrittis, they are logically born or carried over to the next life. So that's what the 41st verse tells you. This is a very important verse. I mean, those who have done a lot of spiritual practices but not fully succeeded in practicing self-restraint, they have not been able to practice total renunciation, aversion to material prosperity and so on. They'll be born in a family where there will be sufficient wealth, there will be a lot of opportunities to study the Vedas, and also the parents' circumstances will be conducive to the continuation of spiritual life. This is the 42nd verse. This is 41st verse. 42nd verse gives another option. What about those who are still more advanced? The 41st verse, 41st sloka verse tells us what happens to those who are not so highly advanced but still done a lot of spiritual practices, practice a lot of spiritual disciplines. 42nd verse tells you what happens to those who are more advanced in their spiritual life. Athava yoginam eva kule bhavadi dhimatam edadhi durlabhadaram loke janma ididrisham. And what about those who are more advanced in spiritual life? They are born in the families who have a tradition of producing great spiritual aspirants, spiritual seekers. So, spiritual life will not be something new to that family culture and tradition. It will be part of an ongoing process in their family tradition. So, the more advanced souls will be born in the homes of yoginam. Yoginam means spiritual seekers, spiritual aspirants, advanced spiritual seekers. And Lord Krishna tells in this verse that this option is rare. Because this happens to those who are much more advanced than those who are referred to in the 41st verse. They may not be Srimadam, they may not be prosperous, they may not be financially very prosperous. Their parents, the family, people will be ascetics, practicing a lot of spiritual disciplines. Not necessarily poor or anything, but they won't much care for wealth and prosperity and so on. So these are two types of metempsychosis that is mentioned in the 6th chapter. Those who have done a lot of spiritual disciplines, practice a lot of prayer and meditation, but not being able to fully practice shama, means withdrawing the senses completely from sense objects. They will be born in a family where they will be able to practice this self-restraint as a continued process of spiritual life. But though the family will be prosperous, so that if they have any unfulfilled desires, they will be able to fulfill those desires. In the second option, 42nd verse, it deals with the higher, more advanced spiritual seekers. They will be born in a family which may not necessarily be very rich or affluent, but will have a tradition of great spiritual seekers. So naturally, it will be the heritage which is much more helpful for continuing the spiritual journey. It's very important, especially 41st verse is very important, because Gita itself tells you earlier, Dhyayato Vishayan Pumsa Sangasteshu Bhajayade Sangha Sanjayade Kama Kama Krodho Bijayade Krodhat Bhavadi Sammoha Sammoha Smriti Vibhrama Smriti Bhramshat Buddhinashu Buddhinashat Pranasyadi. You find in the second chapter of the Gita, in the Prakya Lakshanas section, you find how people fail to practice self-restraint. Because wherever the mind goes, if the mind gets stuck to something, it feels a great attraction towards that. And then mind tries to seek it. The person tries to acquire it and may not always succeed in acquiring whatever he wants to acquire. And if it doesn't succeed, it leads to frustration, disappointment, and that leads to downfall. This could happen to certain persons. That possibility is mentioned in the 42nd verse. But the most vital point, the entire context of the present discussion is, nothing will be lost and you are never late. If anyone who wants to begin his or her spiritual journey, the door is open right in front of you, any day, any moment. You don't have to give up anything, only you have to begin your journey right now. If you can't pray, do something good, do something positive. If you can't pray and meditate and practice Kundalini, people want to do that, If you can't do that, it's better to avoid it. Better to do something noble, something good, something that is broad-minded, something positive, something after doing which we feel a kind of inner tranquility, peace and contentment. That is a criterion. If you want a criterion to judge whether an action is good or bad, action here means mental action, thought, ideas in mind, physical action, any activity, verbal action, the words we speak, all these can produce something positive, something that opens the door right in front of us so that we can begin the journey. So, any noble action will be making a new investment in the spiritual bank, and that will be yours. You have made something permanent, and that will take care of your spiritual life. That is the uniqueness of this concept. See how totally different. First of all, we have to be a good person. We have to talk like a gentleman, act like a gentleman, live like a gentleman, and do things so that people will consider you a real gentleman. It's not that you pray to one God and make an agreement with a God so that you can do whatever you want to all others. Nothing of the kind. It is a matter of pure subjective spiritual journey. Religion is not mentioned in any of these verses. Nothing of the kind. Not that you go to a particular church or a temple or a place where you submit everything you have got and you make an agreement. I shall profess this particular faith. Then I can do whatever I want to everyone else. Nothing of the kind. We have to be a good person. Spiritually, a good person. And you can be a good person by trying to do something good, speaking something good, thinking something good. That's good for others and good for ourselves. And one criterion is, after doing something, after speaking something, after thinking something, if you feel a kind of inner enrichment, inner tranquility and peace. So it's called kridakrityada and kridarthada. You feel a kind of chitta prasada. All these terms are used in different literature. Chitta prasada is used in Patanjali Yoga Sutra. It's also used in the Gita context. And kridarthada and kridakrityada are used in normal language and also in the Gita. I mean, after doing something, we feel, oh, I have done something noble. So we can sleep better. That's something anyone can do. Now, this idea is further elaborated in the 42nd verse, which is very important. Tatradam buddhisam yogam labhade paurvadekikam yatateja tado bhuyasam siddho kurunandana. How this metempsychosis, the reincarnation, actually operates, this particular phenomenon. How does it actually work? Is mentioned here. As I mentioned a number of times, which I formally, in fact, we are doing these Patanjali Yoga Sutra classes every Sunday, 6 o'clock. You can get information from website, Zoom link or YouTube link you can get. We discuss this subject much more elaborately than in the Gita. But the point is this, whatever we do, any action, thought, word or deed, whatever it is, it produces a vritti, becomes a samskara, an impression, it's an attitude, an aptitude, it becomes an interest, a tendency and so on. All these are accumulated in the mental system. Now, how if somebody tells you that all these tendencies are transmigrated to the next life, it makes no sense, because you may have read a wonderful book in this life, you have made a lot of meditation. But the mind which you meditated, the place where you meditated, you don't inherit when you are gone, when you are born again. Naturally, that's true. We have done something wonderful with our hand, with our eyes, all the senses. Those eyes are gone when this life comes to an end. Those hands are gone when this life comes to an end. So how do we inherit samskaras and impressions in the next life? There is something to be discussed here. The point is, our senses, the 5 senses of perception, the 5 senses of action. The eyes, the ear, the sense of smell, the sense of touch, the sense of taste, and also the 5 karmendriyas, the 5 senses of action. They all do many things and they naturally develop certain tendencies in our mind. But these indriyas, these senses are gone. But remember, the tendencies that these senses of perception and mind create in this life, they are stored up somewhere and that is never lost. The subtle tendencies are stored up in a system called a chittam. In fact, a mental world, according to Vedanta, Not according to Patanjali Yoga Sutra, but according to Vedanta, the mental world is divided into 4 compartments. Mana, Buddhi, Chitta, Ahankara. The tendencies of speculation, Sankalpa and Vikalpa. Sankalpa, Vikalpa, Atmika, Antakanuvrti is mind. Speculations, ideas, this or that and so on. Mind is speculating, wavering, thinking this or that, this option or that option. Then mind decides something, that's called intellect or buddhi. Then mind identifies with an action, our ego system. Then mind remembers certain things, that is memory. It's called chitta. So the memories are stored and the identification is also there, and these tendencies, impressions are also stored up there. These are never lost when this body is gone at the time of death. They are born again. When the person is born again, he becomes a child, or she becomes a child. But these tendencies, this is called antakaranam in Vedanta, means mind, intellect, the ego, the mechanism of identification or ego identification, and the repository of memories. All these are inherited, and they are born along with the new body. That's why after certain years, sometimes some people suddenly start manifesting tendencies and impressions which are totally strange and new in that family. It can happen. So certain tendencies begin to manifest at later stage. Shankaracharya actually analyzes this subject in his commentary on the 44th and 43rd verses. He says, if you have good tendencies, they will remain there. If your good tendencies are predominant, then from the next life, immediately, without delay, you begin to manifest those tendencies. If there are bad tendencies that are more dominant, then the good tendencies lie dormant for some time, but never get lost. Bad tendencies may manifest, may express themselves during the early days of the new person, the born child, newly born child. But after the negative samskaras are extinguished, the positive samskaras will begin to manifest. That's why sometimes people turn to spiritual life when they become very old, because all the negative samskaras are being worked out. Now it is time for the positive samskaras to assert themselves. So this is how personality works. So that is expressed here. Tatradam buddhisam yogam labhade pauradehikam. Pauradehya means something associated with the previous body, previous life. That mind, the tendencies, the impressions acquired from previous life. What happens? Again, you connect with those tendencies that you have inherited from your previous life. And then you continue your spiritual journey. You begin to strive for your spiritual life much more vigorously, because there is a latent memory of what you have been striving hard in your previous life. So there's a desire not to fail in this life, in this opportunity. And then you know what happens? You go ahead. This idea behind it. So that actually explains many of the mysteries of human tendencies and impressions. And then in the 44th verse, Purvabhyasena tenaiva kriyadehi avashopi saha jignasuraviyogasya sabda brahmadi vartade. So, by the force of your previous life experiences, disciplines you practiced, these accumulated impressions, tendencies, samskaras aptitudes. They push you forward, they move you forward. They constitute the momentum. So what happened? They bear you and they carry you forward. And actually, one interesting thing happens is in the Gita, this verse tells you is that's a real beginning of spiritual life. Because jijñāsurapi yogasya sabda brahmādi vartate. What it means is, normally we go about doing our work, our duties, our obligations as and when they arise in our life. So the ancient Vedas, especially Karma Kanda, I mean the ritualistic portion of the Karma Kanda, that is Sabda Brahmadi Vartate means. These Karma Kandas, or the ritualistic portions of Karma Kanda, Purva Kanda, they mostly deal with certain rituals, prayers, certain elaborate practices, which take a number of priests. And they do all these rituals, they perform all these rituals for long life, for wealth, for progeny, for prosperity, and so on. Pasyema shraddha sadam, jivema shraddha sadad, bruyasta shraddha sadad. These are mantras they utter, and they offer all these different things on the fire, and they pray to God, give me prosperity, give me wealth, give me wonderful things, a good house, job, and so on. But you don't begin your real spiritual journey at that moment, because your mind is busy with so many things that you're praying for. Of course, to pray to God for addressing a problem in this worldly life is perfectly okay. But real spiritual life begins when you don't pray for worldly prosperities. But again, Lord Krishna says elsewhere, Udara Sarvayeva Ide. He says, even those who pray for material prosperity, suppose you are sick, pray to God, pray in a temple or a church or any place of worship, please pray for health, nothing wrong. Because you are praying to God. God will see to it that next time as you evolve in spiritual life, you pray for something higher. So once you start praying to God, even for material wealth, you are actually beginning the spiritual journey. Because as you progress in spiritual life, and you are sure to make progress in spiritual life, if you pray even for the smallest thing, eventually you will start praying for higher things, and you reach a point when you don't really pray for anything except for the highest spiritual liberation, spiritual enlightenment. That is the real spiritual journey. So that's why jijñāsurapi yogasya sabda brahmādi vartate. Those who even have a wish to lead a spiritual life instead of praying for other things, they have boarded the bus, they will reach the destination. That's why Lord Krishna says, those who do not pray for any of the material prosperities, do not perform any of the rituals, or those who transcended these rituals, they have really started their journey towards the highest spiritual destination. Before concluding, I shall just one passing reference to Shankaracharya's own statement here. So the point, yaha purva janmini krita abhyasa sa purva abhyasa tenaiva balavada kriyadehi yasmat avashapi sa yoga-bhrashta. So it means those who have done lot of good actions in previous life, these good actions, they become tendencies, they become impressions, they become a character, they determine our attitudes. Our previous actions in previous life, which have become tendencies, eventually decide our actions, the way we interpret life, the way we look upon the world, the way we look upon life as a whole, all these are determined by previous tendencies. So there is a logical continuity. And those who have a predominance of spiritual samskaras, healthy tendencies, they will straight away begin their spiritual life during the early part of their life. And those who have only a small portion of healthy samskaras will have to wait a little longer, but at some point they are sure to begin the spiritual journey. We will continue this discussion in the next class. Now we are open for questions and answers. You are most welcome to ask questions. Okay, yeah. Most welcome.
Namaskar, Maharaj.
Yeah, namaskar.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My question is about the sequence of the verses that reference the advantages of family, and then they are followed by verses that emphasize the intensity and steadfastness of spiritual striving.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to see if there's something in the text, other than the placement of these ideas, that suggests that regardless of family birth, the striving is the main thing. That the striving is necessary regardless of advantages of family.
Yeah. No, in this particular section, the teacher is dealing with two different types of those who may have a deviation in their spiritual life before their death. So these two options are given as a direct answer to the question that came from Arjuna. What happens to those who have a deviation? Arjuna's question is not about spiritual seekers in general, but the question could arise to any person. That's an important thing. And the central principle is not the not these two families, what happened to these two families. The central principle is, I mentioned, Nahi kalyana krit kaschit durgatim tadagachati. The verse comes, I can show you what the particular verse. Yeah, it is, it comes, I often don't read the text when I quote, So, 40th verse number 40. You find there the point is, those who do even a little bit of spiritual practice, they never get lost, they are never destroyed. That is the literal translation. What it means is, in fact, that is a central message that dominates the whole chapter here. The discussion of two types of family circumstances is only a direct answer to the problem that Arjuna raised in another context. Of course, here it comes, what happens to the ayadis saddhayo pedo, what happens to those who don't fully succeed. So again, that is 37th verse, yoga charita manasaha, those who have a deviation, those who get lost from the from the path of yoga. That is 37th verse. So such a person is called Yoga-bhrashta. Yoga-bhrashta. Those who get lost, those who have a deviation from the path of spiritual life, such persons are called Yoga-bhrashta. So Lord Krishna's answer explaining the two types of family environments where they may take their birth is a direct answer to the particular part of that question in the 37th verse. That means, what happens to those who get lost on their spiritual path? And what happens if they have done a lot of spiritual disciplines but not fully acquired shama? They'll be born in a family, prosperous family, but there will be a very good set of circumstances for them to continue the spiritual journey. And those who are still more advanced, as in ascetics, suddenly they may have a deviation. They are born in higher families where they may not be, because they passed away before they reached the highest level of renunciation. So they are born in a family of yogis. They do not necessarily in a rich family, but normal families where they don't have any desire to fulfill. So there is no need for them to be born in a prosperous family, but the parents, the circumstances will be naturally a blessed family. Okay, so this is the answer to the particular point that Arjuna raised in this 37th verse. What happens to those who get a deviation, who deviate from the path of yoga? Now, the answer to your question is, it is found in this 40th verse. That means those who do a little bit of spiritual practice, they never come to grief. Remember, the inclusion of family circumstances in this answer is only in the context of Yoga-bhrashta. Yoga-bhrashta means those who have lost on the path of yoga. In general, the statement meant for spiritual seekers in general is found in the 40th verse, where whatever you do, you will not lose anything, you will continue your spiritual journey. This also is there. There are many instances, innumerable examples where you find some very wonderful spiritual persons are born in families where the parents were not necessarily devotees. In fact, the greatest devotee, the Bhagavad, the classical devotional text, is Prahlada. And his father was a demon. He would be, in any modern court of law, he will be imprisoned for 10,000 years. Such a demon he was. Hiranyakashipu. And Hiranyakashipu's son was Prahlada. And Sri Ramakrishna, when Sri Ramakrishna watched the Prahlada's play going on the stage, he went into Samadhi and uttering Prahlada. And he said, Prahladaschasmi Daityanam. Lord Krishna says, among the Daityas, I am Prahlada. Yeah, in the Lord Krishna says in the Gita itself, Prahladaschasmi Daityana. Among the demons, I am Prahlada. And what was his father? Most of the time his father was spending his time and energy denouncing God, doing evil things, doing harm to spiritual seekers. That was his profession and also hobby, Hiranyakashipu. And his elder brother or younger brother was Hiranyaksha, still worse. In such a family, this little boy was born, and he is the greatest devotee in Hindu mythological literature. So pedigree is not an absolute criterion. It's a very important point. Every jiva is an independent traveler. Every jiva, every human being is an independent traveler as far as spiritual journey is concerned. Yeah.
Maharaj,
Yeah. No.
there's a question on YouTube by Mark Goodrich.
Yeah.
Question is, can a saint or great being help in awakening our spiritual aspiration for God realization?
Yeah. Association with any spiritual person, even a saint, especially saint, holy person, may be more helpful. Even association with fellow spiritual seekers will consolidate, reinforce our faith and our tenacity to continue a spiritual journey. Yeah, certainly, yes.
Pranams Maharaj.
Yeah,
They also say that at the time of the death, whatever you think of, you become that in your next life.
yeah.
So even if I, let's say, do a lot of good deeds in this life and think of, let's say, some other thing, would I be born as that thing, or since I've done like lot of good deeds, would I be born as a human again?
Yeah, you know, when we say it comes in the Gita, it's a yam yam vapi smaran bhavam tejityande kalevaram tame vaiti kaunteya sadharma bhava bhavita. In the Gita itself it comes. So the point is, it's not the last thought that comes to our mind when we breathe our last. A set of thoughts together. So normally the thoughts that automatically come to our mind at the last moment in natural death will be a collection of conflicting thought currents. Some of them may be good thoughts, some of them may be passing thoughts, may not be necessarily good. But these thoughts will be determined by our collective life as a whole that we have led. Those who have done a lot of spiritual practices, like the association with spiritual ideas through persons or saints or by reading books or whatever may be, will naturally will have good thoughts, positive thoughts, holy thoughts at the time of death. And that will determine their next life. So we cannot go about doing whatever we want, thinking that at last moment I have a good thought. It doesn't happen that way. Because when our senses become weak, we won't be able to be diplomats. We can't smile, really speaking. That's a very important point. When senses become weak, mind also become weak, we can become weak, and then our natural thought currents and tendencies will emerge, will assert themselves in spite of ourselves. So this is an important point, remember. So normally those who have done a lot of good spiritual deeds or practice spiritual disciplines, and maybe some actions which may not be called spiritual, they need not worry, because they will have predominance of these spiritual tendencies. They will be born again in a more spiritually more conducive set of circumstances. Here, family should not be interpreted in its narrow definition, a particular family or culture, caste or anything. It need not necessarily be so. Set of circumstances, let's make here. So see, it's a gehe, the word geha is used here in this context, geha. Geha means house, and also set of circumstances, environments, in the broader sense. This idea behind.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So thank you for interaction and questions. Thank you, most welcome. Okay. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.